Walter Jenkins stared at the pile of cash on the table. 73 years of life hadn't prepared him for this moment. The FBI agent nodded silently. "That's him," Walter whispered, pointing at the police badge photo. "That's the man who robbed me." Before we dive into this shocking story of corruption and courage, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more true stories of justice being served against all odds. Now, let's rewind to see how a respected elder became entangled in an FBI investigation that would shake an entire police department to its core. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds as Walter Jenkins performed his daily ritual with methodical precision. At 73, the retired Navy veteran moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that discipline creates order and order creates peace. His modest single-story home in Oakwood Heights, a predominantly white suburb of Chicago, was immaculate, not a cushion out of place, not a speck of dust on the polished surfaces. Walter had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, one of the first black families to integrate the area back, when such moves required both courage and stubbornness. He glanced at the silver-framed photograph of his late wife Elaine that held pride of place on the mantelpiece. "Big day today, sweetheart," he murmured, touching the frame briefly, before straightening his crisp, blue button-down shirt. Walter's life had fallen into a comfortable pattern since Elaine's passing 3 years ago. Mondays and Wednesdays, he volunteered at the Oakwood Heights Community Center, teaching chess to children. Tuesdays, he tended his immaculate garden. Thursdays were for doctor appointments and errands. Fridays, he had lunch with his son Michael and his family. He kept to himself, mostly a quiet presence in the neighborhood that had never fully welcomed him but had grudgingly come to accept him over the decades. But today was different. Today, Walter had an important errand, one that filled him with both pride and a familiar wariness. His granddaughter Lisa was starting her second year at Howard University Law School, following in the footsteps of her grandmother. Walter had promised to help with her tuition, a promise he intended to keep with the same steadfast reliability that characterized everything he did. Walter checked his watch, nodded to himself, and picked up his car keys from the small ceramic dish Elaine had made in a pottery class 20 years ago. He walked out to his garage, where his pride and joy waited, a 1985 Cadillac DeVille, in pristine condition, the deep burgundy paint gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. The car had been his reward to himself after 30 years of naval service, and he maintained it with religious devotion. The drive to First National Bank of Oakwood Heights took exactly 12 minutes. Walter noted with satisfaction that he arrived precisely at 9:15, just as the doors were opening. He straightened his tie, grabbed his checkbook from the glove compartment, and walked with measured steps toward the imposing brick building. Walter had been banking here for 35 years, yet still felt the subtle shift in atmosphere whenever he entered, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the overly polite but distant greetings, the careful watching. He approached the teller window where a young white woman he didn't recognize plastered on a customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," Walter said politely. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." He slid his ID and account information across the counter. The teller, whose nameplate read Brittany, glanced at his information, then at him, then back at the information. "And how much will you be withdrawing today, sir?" Walter had anticipated this moment and kept his expression neutral. $8,000, please." He watched as Brittany's eyebrows shot up slightly before she controlled her expression. "One moment, sir. I'll need to speak with my manager for a withdrawal of that size." She disappeared into a back office, leaving Walter standing at the counter. He noticed that the white gentleman 2 windows down was being served without interruption, despite requesting what appeared to be a substantial transaction of his own. 5 minutes passed before Brittany returned with an older man in a Navy suit. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Thomas Wilson, the branch manager. For security purposes, I'll need to verify some information for such a large cash withdrawal." Walter nodded, his face betraying nothing of the familiar frustration building inside. Of course. What followed was a 20-minute process of verification questions, forms, and subtle implications about why someone like him would need so much cash. Walter answered each question with the patience and dignity he had cultivated through decades of similar interactions. "It's for my granddaughter's law school tuition," he explained, though he knew he owed them no explanation. "She's at Howard University." And why Cash Wilson pressed his pen, hovering over the form. "Wouldn't a cashier's check be more appropriate?" Walter met his gaze steadily. "I prefer to handle it this way." "Is there a problem with my account?" Wilson finally relented after Walter gently reminded him that he had been a customer for over 3 decades and had never overdrawn his account even once. The cash was counted out, meticulously recounted, and finally handed over in an envelope with the bank's logo. Walter carefully placed it in his worn leather wallet, a gift from Elaine on their 40th anniversary. He thanked the manager and teller with the same politeness he had shown upon entering, then walked out with his head high, refusing to let the indignity of the experience diminish him. As he settled back into his Cadillac, Walter's phone rang. An unusual occurrence, as few people called him during the day. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Mr. Walter Jenkins," a woman's voice asked. "This is Agent Diane Reynolds with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was hoping we might be able to meet privately to discuss some banking security measures in your area." Walter's hand tightened on the phone. In his experience, unexpected contact with law enforcement rarely led to anything positive for a black man, regardless of age or standing. "May I ask what this is concerning specifically?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It's sensitive," Mr. Jenkins, Agent Reynolds replied, "but I can assure you you're not in any trouble. We're investigating a series of incidents targeting elderly residents in Oakwood Heights, and we believe you might be able to assist us." Walter hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, his sense of civic duty won out. "Where would you like to meet?" They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the bank, a public place where Walter felt reasonably safe. Agent Reynolds was easy to spot, a black woman in her 40s wearing a practical pantsuit, her FBI credentials displayed briefly but clearly as she sat down across from him. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice low. "I'll get straight to the point. We've been tracking a series of thefts targeting elderly black residents in Oakwood Heights and surrounding areas. The pattern suggests someone with access to banking information is identifying potential victims." Walter listened, his face impassive, but his mind racing. "And how does this involve me?" Agent Reynolds took a deep breath. "The money you just withdrew from the bank has been marked with an invisible ink that can be detected under certain lights. It's part of our investigation to track where this money goes if it's stolen." Walter's composure finally broke. "You used me as bait without my knowledge or consent." His voice, though quiet, carried an edge of controlled outrage. "We had reason to believe you might be targeted," Agent Reynolds explained, having the grace to look somewhat contrite. "Your profile matches the other victims, retired, respected member of the community, regular banking habits. We needed to act quickly when we saw the withdrawal request come through the system." Walter sat back, processing this information. Part of him wanted to walk away immediately, to wash his hands of whatever complicated situation he'd been dragged into. But another part, the part that had fought for respect and dignity his entire life, recognized that if not him, then another elderly black resident would be victimized. "I should report this to my son." "He's an attorney," Walter said finally. "I understand your anger," Mr. Jenkins, Agent Reynolds said, "but we're asking for your cooperation. If you are targeted, we can finally catch whoever is behind these thefts. We'll ensure your safety and the return of your property." Walter considered her words carefully. Finally, he nodded once decisively. "I'll help you, but on my terms. I want complete transparency about the investigation, and I want your personal assurance about my safety." Agent Reynolds smiled for the first time. "You have it, Mr. Jenkins. And for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Together, we might be able to stop this from happening to anyone else." As Walter drove home, the marked money secure in his wallet, he couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. He had spent his life avoiding confrontation with authorities whenever possible, a survival strategy he had learned early and passed on to his son and granddaughter. Now here he was deliberately placing himself in harm's way. Elaine would have called him foolish, but she also would have understood why he couldn't turn away. Some battles, she always said, choose you rather than the other way around. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oakwood Heights as Walter guided his Cadillac through the familiar streets toward home. He drove exactly 3 miles per hour below the speed limit, a habit formed over decades of careful navigation through predominantly white neighborhoods. The car purred smoothly beneath him, the leather seats creaking softly as he turned onto Maple Avenue. Walter had just passed the community park when he noticed the flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. His heart rate increased slightly, but he maintained his composure as he signaled and pulled carefully to the curb, positioning his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they would be visible. Through his mirror, he watched as a white officer emerged from the patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached. Walter lowered his window and waited face-neutral posture, non-threatening. "License and registration," the officer demanded, without preamble, his tone clipped and authoritative. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Walter recognized the face immediately. Officer Bradley Moore, a 15-year veteran of the Oakwood Heights Police Department. They had crossed paths before at community events, though the officer had never acknowledged him. "Good afternoon," Officer Walter replied calmly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Moore's face hardened slightly. "You were driving erratically. License and registration now." Walter knew he had been driving perfectly, as he always did. But he also knew better than to argue. "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, and my license is in my wallet in my back pocket." He narrated his movements carefully, an old habit that had never stopped being necessary. He handed over the documents with steady hands. Officer Moore scrutinized them with exaggerated care, glancing between the papers and Walter's face multiple times. "This is a nice car for someone like you," Moore commented, running his hand along the immaculate doorframe. Had it long, Walter felt the familiar burn of indignation, but kept his voice level. "Since 1985. I purchased it new after retiring from the Navy." Moore made a non-committal sound, continuing his inspection of the documents. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Walter's wallet still in his hand after retrieving his license. It was thicker than usual due to the cash inside. "What's in the wallet, old man? Looks pretty full." Walter tensed imperceptibly. "Just some cash for a family matter, officer." Moore's demeanor shifted, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Jenkins." Walter knew his rights, knew he could ask if he was being detained, knew he could request a reason. But 73 years of life as a black man in America had taught him that rights existed primarily on paper when facing certain officers. He complied, moving slowly and deliberately. "Stand by the trunk," Moore instructed, then began a search of the car's interior without permission or probable cause. Walter stood silently, hands visible as Moore rifled through his vehicle. Finding nothing of interest, the officer turned his attention back to Walter. "Empty your pockets and hand me that wallet." Walter hesitated for just a moment before complying. Moore opened the wallet and his eyes widened at the sight of the $8,000 in neatly arranged bills. "Where'd you get this kind of money?" he demanded, suspicion dripping from every word. "I withdrew it from my account at First National this morning," Walter explained evenly. "It's for my granddaughter's law school tuition at Howard University." Moore laughed a short, dismissive sound. "Sure it is. Nobody carries this much cash for tuition. This looks like drug money to me." Walter felt a flash of anger but kept his voice steady. "You can call the bank to verify, officer. I have the withdrawal receipt in my wallet." Moore ignored him, continuing to thumb through the bills. "I'm going to have to confiscate this as evidence in an ongoing narcotics investigation," he announced, folding the money and sliding it into his own pocket rather than an evidence bag. "What? That's absurd." Walter finally let his indignation show. "That money is for my granddaughter's education. I legally withdrew it from my own account. You have no right to take it." Moore's face hardened. "Are you resisting, old man? Because I can make this a lot worse for you." He stepped closer, hand resting meaningfully on his holstered weapon. "You can file a claim with the department if you want this back. But between you and me, civil forfeiture is a bitch to fight." He scribbled on his ticket pad and thrust a citation at Walter. "Improper lane usage. Pay it or contest it, I don't care. But if I were you, I'd forget about the money." Things have a way of getting complicated when people make accusations against officers, especially people who don't belong in neighborhoods like this in the first place. Walter took the ticket, his hand steady, despite the rage and humiliation coursing through him. He watched as Officer Moore returned to his patrol car, Walter's $8,000 now in his pocket. As Moore drove away, Walter remained standing beside his beloved Cadillac, the unjust citation clutched in his hand. Only when the patrol car disappeared around the corner did he allow his shoulders to slump slightly. He reached into his pocket and pressed a small button on the recording device Agent Reynolds had provided him, just in case. The red light indicated it had captured the entire encounter. Walter took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and got back into his car. The theft had occurred exactly as the FBI had predicted. But unlike the other victims who had suffered in silence, Walter now had evidence, and he had no intention of letting Officer Bradley Moore get away with this. Walter didn't wait to call Agent Reynolds. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed her number from the safety of his driveway, the Cadillac still running as if ready for a quick escape. "He took it," Walter said simply when she answered. "All of it." "Officer Bradley Moore, badge number 873. Agent Reynolds' voice shifted immediately into professional mode. "Are you safe, Mr. Jenkins? Are you at home?" "In my driveway," Walter confirmed. "He's gone, but I have everything recorded. Stay there. I'm 15 minutes away with Agent Johnson." True to her word, a nondescript sedan pulled up precisely 14 minutes later. Agent Reynolds emerged with a younger black man who introduced himself as Agent Marcus Johnson. Walter led them inside his movements, stiff with suppressed emotion. In his living room with the blinds drawn, Walter recounted the encounter in meticulous detail, his voice steady despite the humiliation still fresh in his mind. He handed over the recording device, and the agents listened intently, their expressions darkening as Officer Moore's voice played through the small speaker. "He didn't even pretend to place it into evidence," Walter concluded. "Just put my money directly into his pocket and threatened me if I pursued it." Agent Johnson shook his head in disgust. "But he doesn't know about the marked bills. That's our advantage." Agent Reynolds nodded. "Mr. Jenkins, what happened to you today is unfortunately not an isolated incident. We've been tracking similar reports for months. All elderly black residents, all with substantial cash withdrawals, all stopped for minor or fabricated traffic violations." She hesitated, then continued. "What makes these cases particularly difficult is that most victims are too afraid to come forward officially. You're the first willing to cooperate fully." Walter's jaw tightened. "How many others?" "At least 7 confirmed cases we know of," Agent Johnson replied, "but we suspect many more have gone unreported." Reynolds opened her laptop and showed Walter a map of Oakwood Heights with several locations marked. "These are where the reported incidents took place. We believe Officer Moore isn't acting alone. The pattern suggests coordination between the bank and the police department." Walter leaned forward, studying the map. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, fought in Vietnam, served this country for 3 decades in the Navy, and today I was robbed by someone sworn to protect and serve." He looked up at the agents. "What happens now?" Agent Reynolds explained the technology embedded in the marked bills. "Each one has a unique identifier that can be traced. We've already set up surveillance on Officer Moore. The moment he spends any of that money, we'll know. But we need to move carefully. If there's a larger network involved, we want to identify all participants." Walter insisted on being kept informed throughout the investigation. "This isn't just about my money anymore. This is about dignity and justice for our entire community." As the agents prepared to leave, Walter was struck by a memory from his early days in the Navy 1968 when he'd faced discrimination from his commanding officer. He'd filed a complaint despite warnings from fellow sailors. The investigation had gone nowhere officially, but the harassment had stopped. Sometimes he'd learned simply refusing to be silent was a victory in itself. After the agents left, Walter called his granddaughter Lisa. He didn't mention the theft or the FBI investigation, not wanting to worry her, but he sought her legal perspective hypothetically. "Grandpa, if something like that happened, you should speak with community leaders," she advised. Strength in numbers, you know. People need to know these things are happening. Walter considered her advice. Perhaps he said noncommittally, "Just curious about the legal process. How are your studies going?" After they hung up, Walter sat in his armchair, the one facing the window that gave him a clear view of the street. As darkness fell, he noticed a police cruiser driving slowly past his house. Then, another 30 minutes later. The message was clear: he was being watched. Walter turned off the living room light but remained seated in the darkness, his resolve hardening with each passing hour. He had faced discrimination his entire life, from schoolyard bullies in the 50s, from superior officers in the 60s, from neighbors and colleagues in every decade since. Each time he had chosen his battles carefully, knowing that survival sometimes meant strategic silence. But not this time. This time Walter Jenkins would be heard. Do you think Walter made the right choice by cooperating with the FBI? Comment number 1, if you believe he's brave for standing up against corruption, or number 2, if you think he's putting himself in unnecessary danger. Hit that like button if you admire his courage and subscribe to hear more stories of everyday heroes fighting for justice. The police cruisers circling Walter's house are clearly meant to intimidate him, but will their tactics work, or will they only strengthen his resolve? Stay tuned to find out how deep this corruption really goes. The early morning stillness was broken by the soft buzz of Walter's phone. Agent Reynolds' voice came through tense with urgency. "We've got movement." Moore met with Sergeant James Wilson last night. There was a clear exchange. "We have it on surveillance." Walter sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. Wilson, James Wilson. The name triggered an unpleasant memory. 6 foot tall, balding with a birthmark on his right temple. "That's him," Reynolds confirmed, surprise, evident in her voice. "You know him." Walter's grip tightened on the phone. "He hassled me at a community center fundraiser last year, questioned why I was there, implied I might be casing the place. I've seen him around the neighborhood for years, always watching, always suspicious." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Jenkins, this is bigger than we initially thought. We've identified partial fingerprints on banking records of other victims. Wilson's prints are among them. He appears to be Moore's direct supervisor." A cold understanding settled over Walter. "So it's not just random targeting, it's systematic." "Exactly," Agent Reynolds replied. "We need to expand our investigation. Would you be willing to meet with other potential victims? Having someone from the community might make them more comfortable coming forward." Walter agreed without hesitation. Over the next 3 days, he met privately with 3 other elderly black residents who had experienced similar thefts: Eleanor Washington, a retired school principal; Clarence Thomas, a former postal worker; and Ruby Davis, who had owned a successful beauty salon before retiring. Each told a nearly identical story: large cash withdrawals, seemingly random traffic stops, money confiscated as evidence in unspecified investigations. None had reported the incidents officially, fear and past experience convincing them it would only make matters worse. "They took $4,000 from me," Eleanor said, her voice quavering with suppressed anger. "My grandson's college fund. Officer Moore said it matched the description of money from a robbery. When I went to the station to complain, Sergeant Wilson told me to go home before I created problems for myself." Walter listened to each story with growing indignation, then carefully explained the FBI investigation. Initially reluctant, all 3 eventually agreed to provide formal statements after Walter shared his own experience and the evidence he had gathered. Meanwhile, Officer Moore was growing increasingly paranoid. The surveillance team reported that he had attempted to deposit $3,000 at his bank, triggering the silent alert from the marked bills. He had also made several calls to Sergeant Wilson, their conversation guarded, but clearly concerned about that old man on Maple Avenue. On the 4th night after the theft, Walter was reading in his living room when a sharp knock came at his door. Through the peephole he saw Officer Moore, standing on his porch, one hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. Walter activated the recording device in his pocket before opening the door, just enough to see through the security chain. "Officer Moore, what can I do for you at this hour?" Moore's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just following up on that citation, Mr. Jenkins, making sure you understand the process for paying or contesting it. It was nearly 10 at night, well beyond any reasonable hour for such a visit. Walter kept his expression neutral. I understand the process, thank you. Moore nodded, his eyes drifting past Walter to scan what he could see of the living room. Nice place you've got here. Been in the neighborhood long 40 years, Walter replied evenly. Moore's eyebrows rose. That right, interesting. You know, we've had some complaints about suspicious individuals in the area. Burglaries, that sort of thing. Just want to make sure our senior residents are taking proper precautions. The threat was barely veiled. Walter met his gaze steadily. I appreciate your concern, Officer Moore. I'm quite careful about security. Moore's smile tightened. Good to hear. You know, Mr. Jenkins, in communities like Oakwood Heights, it's important for everyone to understand their place. Keeps things running smoothly, if you know what I mean. Walter's expression remained impassive, though his heart hammered in his chest. I believe I do, Great Moore said, stepping back. Sleep well, Mr. Jenkins. We'll be keeping a close eye on things around here. After Moore left, Walter immediately called Agent Reynolds to report the intimidation attempt. The recording would be added to their growing evidence file. The following morning brought news that further expanded the scope of the investigation. Agent Johnson arrived at Walter's home with a grim expression. We've been following the money trail from previous incidents, he explained, spreading photos on Walter's kitchen table. The marked bills from your case led us to Wilson, but now we're seeing connections to several other officers. And look at this. He pointed to a surveillance photo showing Sergeant Wilson entering a private office. That's Police Chief Robert Thompson. We have reason to believe he's aware of the scheme, possibly even directing it. Walter stared at the photo, a cold weight settling in his stomach. The rot goes all the way to the top. Agent Johnson nodded. We're still gathering evidence, but it appears so. As the investigation expanded, so did the pushback. Eleanor Washington called Walter in tears. Someone had spray-painted racial slurs on her garage door overnight. Clarence Thomas reported being followed on his daily walk. The message was clear, someone knew they were talking. The community was beginning to notice as well. Walter overheard conversations at the grocery store, at church, at the community center. Hushed discussions about police harassment, about elderly residents being targeted. A local journalist, Sarah Chen, from the Oakwood Heights Gazette, had begun asking questions about patterns in police stops. When she approached Walter after a community center chess lesson, he faced a difficult decision. Mr. Jenkins, I'm hearing concerning reports about elderly residents being targeted by police. Would you be willing to comment? Walter thought of Agent Reynolds' warning about compromising the investigation. But he also thought of Eleanor's garage, of the fear in Ruby Davis's eyes, of the decades of silence that had allowed such abuses to flourish. Not at this time, he said finally, but I would suggest you keep asking questions. That evening, Walter had a long conversation with his granddaughter, Lisa. Without revealing details that might endanger her, he discussed the ethics of anonymous whistleblowing. Sometimes, Lisa told him, the public has a right to know, even when official channels are still working through the process. The next morning, Sarah Chen received an anonymous package containing dates, locations, and patterns of police stops targeting elderly black residents. No names, no specific allegations, just data that told its own damning story. 3 days later, a small article appeared on page 3 of the Gazette. Questions arise about police targeting of elderly residents. The Oakwood Heights Police Department issued an immediate denial, calling the allegations baseless and irresponsible. But Walter noticed something important. The police cruisers that had been regularly circling his block suddenly stopped appearing. The surveillance had been replaced by something more subtle. The game was changing, and Walter knew the stakes were only getting higher. Walter stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, sleep eluding him for the third night in a row. It was 2:17 in the morning, according to the glowing digits of his bedside clock. The house creaked and settled around him, ordinary sounds that now made him start and listen intently. Was that a car slowing down outside, footsteps on the porch? His rational mind knew that the FBI had surveillance on his home, that Agent Reynolds had promised protection. But decades of experience had taught Walter that promises of protection often fell short for people who looked like him. He hadn't told Michael or Lisa the full extent of what was happening. His son called daily, now clearly concerned about the shadows under Walter's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. "Dad, you don't seem yourself. What's going on?" Walter had deflected, mentioning insomnia, normal concerns about Lisa's tuition. But Michael was a lawyer, trained to detect evasions. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, right?" The question hung between them, laden with a lifetime of understanding about Walter's stoic nature, his reluctance to burden others with his troubles. When Lisa visited that weekend, Walter found it even harder to maintain the pretense. His granddaughter had Elaine's perceptiveness, those same knowing eyes that seemed to look straight through any facade. "Grandpa, you're not sleeping," she stated simply over breakfast, "and you keep checking the windows. Are you feeling safe here?" The question pierced Walter's carefully constructed composure. Was he safe? Were any of them truly safe in a community where those sworn to protect could rob with impunity? The weight of the decision pressed down on him: continue alone, or involve his family in a potentially dangerous situation. After Lisa left, promising to return the following weekend, Walter made his decision. He called Michael and asked him to come alone. His son arrived within the hour, concern etched on his face. Walter led him to the kitchen table, the same place where he and Elaine had once helped Michael with his homework, had discussed college applications, had celebrated job offers and mourned losses. "Something's happened." Walter began, his voice steady, despite the churning in his stomach. "I need your legal advice, but more importantly, I need your discretion." Over the next hour, Walter detailed everything: the marked money, Officer Moore's theft, the expanding investigation, the intimidation tactics. Michael's expression transformed from concern to shock to cold anger. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he demanded, rising from his chair to pace the kitchen. "These officers committed multiple felonies. They robbed you at gunpoint, essentially. We should file charges, directly go to the media, call a press conference." Walter raised a hand. "The FBI has a broader investigation. Going public now could compromise their ability to uncover the full extent of the corruption." "The FBI," Michael scoffed. "Dad, with all due respect, you're 73 years old. You fought these battles in your day. This isn't your responsibility anymore." Walter met his son's gaze steadily. "If not me, then who? Eleanor, Washington, Ruby Davis. Someone needs to stand up, Michael. Someone they can't ignore or intimidate." The argument continued for nearly an hour, father and son locked in a fundamental disagreement about risk, responsibility, and justice. Finally, Michael slumped back into his chair. "At least come stay with us until this is resolved. Tanya and the kids would love to have you, and you'd be safer in the city." Walter considered the offer. His pride resisted the idea of being driven from his home, but practicality suggested it might be the wisest course. "Just until the FBI makes progress," he conceded finally. As Walter packed a small suitcase, his phone rang. Agent Johnson wanted to meet immediately. "We have new information about Chief Thompson. It's sensitive. We should discuss in person." Walter agreed to meet at a diner halfway between Oakwood Heights and Chicago. The news was worse than he had anticipated. "We've uncovered financial records suggesting Thompson isn't just aware of the scheme, he's directly profiting from it." Agent Johnson explained quietly, his coffee untouched between them. "Multiple offshore accounts linked to shell companies. Wilson makes regular deposits. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years. Walter's hand tightened around his mug. 5 years. How many victims are we really talking about? Agent Johnson looked grim. Potentially dozens, maybe more. Many probably never reported it or even recognized it as part of a pattern rather than isolated incidents of bad luck or misunderstanding. The implications were staggering. A systematic targeting of elderly black residents orchestrated by the very top of the police department, operating for years with impunity. This isn't just about the money anymore, Walter said quietly. This is about bringing down a corrupt system. Agent Johnson nodded. Which is why we need to move carefully. Thompson has political connections, friends in the prosecutor's office. One wrong move and evidence could disappear, witnesses could be pressured. Walter thought of Eleanor's vandalized home, of the late-night visit from Officer Moore. The intimidation had already begun. While Walter was digesting this information, Developments elsewhere were accelerating the timeline. Officer Moore and Sergeant Wilson had met again, this time in a bar well outside Oakwood Heights. Their conversation, captured by FBI surveillance, revealed growing paranoia. "Something's off about those bills," Moore muttered, hunched over his third whiskey. "The bank called about unusual markings when I tried to deposit some." Wilson glanced around the nearly empty bar. "You think it's marked? I don't know. But that old man Jenkins, he's connected to something. There've been people watching his house, not patrol something else." Wilson cursed softly. "We need to contain this, if he's talking to others." "Exactly," Moore agreed. "Washington, Davis, Thomas, they're all connected through that community center. If they start comparing notes, then we make sure they don't," Wilson stated flatly. "Start with the loudest one. Make an example." The surveillance team reported this conversation immediately to Agent Reynolds, who called Walter with urgent advice. "Mr. Jenkins, we have reason to believe your friends may be in danger. We're arranging protection, but they need to be warned." Walter made the calls personally, his voice calm, despite the gravity of the situation. Eleanor's response was immediate fear. "They already vandalized my home, Walter. What's next?" Her voice broke. "I'm 78 years old. I can't live like this." When local journalist Sarah Chen published a follow-up article expanding on her previous reporting, the pressure increased. The piece didn't name names but included anonymous quotes from elderly residents who fear retaliation, describing police harassment and theft. The Oakwood Heights Police Department issued a sharply worded denial, suggesting the newspaper was engaging in reckless anti-police rhetoric based on unsubstantiated claims. Chief Thompson himself made a rare public statement, expressing complete confidence in the integrity of our officers and promising to investigate any legitimate complaints through proper channels. Walter read the statement with grim amusement. The proper channels reported directly to the corrupt chief. The circle was designed to be impenetrable. That night, alone in the guest room of Michael's Chicago apartment, Walter faced a crisis of conscience. The FBI investigation was methodical but slow. Meanwhile, vulnerable people remained at risk. Public awareness might pressure the department, but it could also compromise the investigation or increase retaliation against witnesses. Personal safety suggested staying quiet, but justice demanded speaking out. Walter stared at his phone for a long time before composing a careful text to Lisa. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to share information about ongoing wrongdoing without compromising an investigation, what would be the most responsible approach? Her response came within minutes. Hypothetically, focus on patterns and systems rather than specific incidents or individuals. Protect identities of vulnerable parties. Consider using a trusted intermediary with journalistic credentials. Walter thanked her and sat in silence for another hour before making his decision. The next morning, Sarah Chen received another anonymous package. This one contained decades of data on police interactions in Oakwood Heights, statistical analyses showing racial disparities in stop citations and complaints. Nothing that would compromise the FBI's investigation of specific officers, but everything needed to expose the systemic problem. 3 days later, her comprehensive article appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition. Analysis reveals decades of racial disparities in Oakwood Heights policing. The community reaction was immediate and divided. Some residents expressed outrage at the revelations. Others defended the police department and questioned the methodology. But no one could ignore the conversation anymore. Walter watched from Michael's apartment as the story broke, feeling both vindicated and apprehensive. The truth was finally emerging, but the most dangerous phase was yet to come. Those with the most to lose would fight hardest to maintain the status quo. And Walter knew from long experience that systems of power rarely surrendered without a struggle. 6 days after Sarah Chen's explosive front-page article, Agent Reynolds requested an urgent meeting at the FBI field office. Walter arrived to find both Reynolds and Johnson waiting with tense expressions and a table covered with surveillance photos. "We've tracked most of the marked bills," Reynolds began without preamble. "They're moving through a sophisticated network." She pointed to images showing money changing hands between Moore Wilson and 3 other officers Walter didn't recognize. But the real breakthrough is here. Johnson slid forward a financial document. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands linked directly to Sergeant Wilson and, more importantly, to Chief Thompson himself. They've been funneling money through a shell company for years. Walter studied the documents carefully. Despite his lack of financial expertise, the implications were clear. This isn't opportunistic theft. This is organized crime wearing police badges. Exactly, Reynolds confirmed. Based on the financial records we've obtained, this scheme has been operating for at least 5 years, possibly longer. How many victims? Walter asked the question that had been haunting him. Johnson's expression darkened. Conservative estimate, at least 60. But potentially many more who never reported the incidents. The scale of the corruption was staggering. Dozens of elderly black residents systematically targeted, robbed under color of law, intimidated into silence. Walter felt a cold anger solidifying within him. "What's the next step?" Reynolds hesitated, exchanging a glance with Johnson. "We believe we have enough evidence to move on Moore and Wilson. But Chief Thompson is more insulated. We need something more direct to connect him conclusively to the scheme." "You want to set a trap," Walter stated, recognizing the unspoken strategy. "Using me as bait. Again, it would be completely voluntary," Johnson emphasized quickly, "and with full protection this time. But yes, we think a controlled operation could force Thompson to reveal his direct involvement." Walter considered the proposition. At 73, he had hoped his days of fighting for basic dignity and justice would be behind him. He had served his country, raised a successful son, contributed to his community. He had earned a peaceful retirement. But the faces of Eleanor Washington, Clarence Thomas, Ruby Davis, and dozens of unnamed others rose in his mind. This wasn't just about his $8,000 anymore. This was about a system that had preyed on the vulnerable for years with impunity. "Tell me the plan," he said finally. The operation was meticulously designed. Walter would return to his home in Oakwood Heights, making his presence known around the neighborhood. He would visit First National Bank again, engaging the same teller who had served him previously. The FBI had coordinated with bank management, carefully excluding any potentially compromised employees to ensure that Walter would be able to withdraw another substantial sum, this time $10,000 in marked bills. "We need to make it too tempting to ignore," Reynolds explained. "Based on the pattern, Moore typically waits a day or two after a large withdrawal before making a stop. We'll have agents positioned throughout the neighborhood, and you'll be under constant surveillance for protection." Walter nodded, studying the detailed operational plans. "And if Thompson gets directly involved, that's what we're hoping for," Johnson replied. "The more senior the officer we can catch in the act, the stronger our case against the entire network." 3 days later, Walter entered First National Bank at precisely 9:15 in the morning. He approached Brittany's window with the same dignified posture he had maintained throughout his life. "Good morning," he greeted her politely. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." Brittany's eyes widened slightly in recognition, her gaze darting toward the manager's office. "Of course, Mr. Jenkins. How much will you be withdrawing today?" $10,000, Walter stated calmly, watching her reaction. The same verification process ensued, though this time Walter noted the branch manager's barely concealed surprise that he had returned after the previous incident. The cash was counted out with the same meticulous care, and Walter placed it in the same worn leather wallet before returning to his Cadillac. As he drove home, Walter was acutely aware of the unmarked FBI vehicles positioned strategically throughout the neighborhood. Agent Reynolds' voice came through the small earpiece he wore. "All units in position. You're doing great, Mr. Jenkins." Walter continued his normal routine, stopping at the grocery store, waving to neighbors, spending an hour at the community center teaching chess to children. All the while, he waited for the inevitable police cruiser to appear. It took less time than expected. Walter was pulling into a pharmacy parking lot when Officer Moore's patrol car turned in behind him, lights flashing. Walter's heart rate increased, but his hands remained steady as he parked and waited. "He's earlier than anticipated," Reynolds' voice noted in his ear. "All units maintain positions, but be ready to move. Mr. Jenkins, remember we can intervene at any sign of escalation." Moore approached Walter's window with the same aggressive posture as beforehand, resting near his weapon. License and registration he demanded, without preamble. Walter complied silently, watching Moore's eyes narrow as he recognized him. Mr. Jenkins. Twice in 1 month. What a coincidence. Walter maintained his calm exterior. Is there a problem? Officer Moore's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just a routine traffic stop. Step out of the vehicle, please. As Walter complied, he noticed Moore scanning the area, his manner more cautious than during their previous encounter. Hands on the car, Moore instructed, beginning a pat-down that was far more thorough than necessary. When he felt Walter's wallet, his expression changed. What's this, another cash withdrawal? Walter met his gaze steadily. My money was never returned from the last time you took it. I needed to replace it for my granddaughter's tuition. Moore's face hardened. You filed a complaint. It wasn't a question. I exercised my rights as a citizen, Walter replied, a new edge to his voice. And I recorded our last encounter. Every word. Moore's hand moved to his weapon. That's a serious accusation, old man, one that could get you in a lot of trouble. For the first time, Walter abandoned his lifelong strategy of deferential compliance. He straightened to his full height, looking Moore directly in the eye. No, Officer Moore. It's you who's in trouble. Theft under color of law is a federal crime. So is civil rights violation. So is conspiracy. Moore's face flushed with anger. You threatening me. You have no idea who you're dealing with. He grabbed Walter's arm, roughly pushing him against the Cadillac. I'm confiscating this money as evidence just like last time. And if you know what's good for you, you'll forget it ever existed. Walter winced at the painful grip, but maintained his defiant gaze. I will not be silent. Not anymore. Not after decades of men like you abusing their power. Moore's grip tightened painfully. Men like me keep this town safe from men like you. Now shut your mouth before I federal agents. Hands in the air. The command came from all directions as FBI personnel emerged from unmarked vehicles, weapons drawn. Moore froze his hands, still gripping Walter's arm. This is a mistake, he stammered, releasing Walter and raising his hands slowly. I'm conducting a legitimate traffic stop. Agent Reynolds approached, her badge displayed prominently. Officer Bradley Moore, you're under arrest for theft, civil rights violations, conspiracy, and corruption. You have the right to remain silent. As Moore was being handcuffed and led to an FBI vehicle, a police cruiser screeched into the parking lot. Sergeant Wilson emerged, his face contorted with rage until he registered the scene before him. His expression shifted instantly from anger to calculated neutrality. What's going on here? This is Oakwood Heights jurisdiction. Agent Johnson stepped forward. Sergeant James Wilson, we have a warrant for your arrest as well. He began reading Wilson his rights as the sergeant's face drained of color. This is a mistake, Wilson protested, his eyes darting to Walter with undisguised hatred. This man is making false accusations against respected officers. Walter stood silently by his Cadillac, watching, as the two officers who had terrorized his community for years were placed in separate vehicles. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the parking lot, several people recording the scene on their phones. Walter recognized Sarah Chen among them, her press credentials visible as she documented the arrests. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Oakwood Heights and beyond. Local television news crews arrived at the police station as Moore and Wilson were processed. Walter declined all requests for immediate comment, following Agent Reynolds' advice to let the investigation proceed methodically. That evening, as Walter sat in his living room with Agents Reynolds and Johnson, they reviewed the day's developments. Moore is already looking to make a deal, Reynolds reported. He's offering to give up his superiors in exchange for leniency. Including Thompson? Walter asked. Johnson nodded. He claims Thompson not only knew about the scheme but received a percentage of all money taken. We're building a case for a warrant, but we need to move carefully. Thompson has powerful political connections. Walter considered this information. So what happens now? We continue gathering evidence, Reynolds explained. The marked bills from today's operation have already been logged as evidence. Combined with the financial records and Moore's testimony, we're building a solid case. But, she hesitated. The department will fight back. Thompson won't go down without a struggle. As if confirming her warning, Walter's phone rang. The display showed unknown caller. With the agent's approval, he answered and put it on speaker. Mr. Jenkins, a digitally altered voice began. This unfortunate situation could be resolved easily. $20,000 compensation for your trouble. Double what was taken. All you need to do is withdraw your cooperation with the federal investigation. Walter's eyes met Reynolds, who nodded encouragingly. "And who am I speaking with?" Walter asked calmly. "A concerned citizen who wants to see this community return to normal," the voice replied. "This offer expires in 24 hours. The call ended abruptly. "We'll trace it," Johnson said immediately, already on his phone, to the technical team. "But I'd bet my badge it leads back to Thompson or someone close to him." Walter set his phone down slowly. "They think I can be bought off. That justice has a price tag." "They've never met anyone like you, Mr. Jenkins," Reynolds said, with quiet respect. "Most people would have given up long ago." Walter looked at the photograph of Elaine on the mantelpiece. "My wife always said dignity isn't what others give you, it's what you refuse to let them take away." Did Walter make the right choice confronting Officer Moore directly rather than remaining passive? Comment number 1. If you think standing up to bullies is always the right choice, or number 2, if you believe his confrontation was too risky. Hit that like button if you're amazed by Walter's courage, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of injustice. With the arrests of Moore and Wilson, the corrupt system is starting to crumble. But will Chief Thompson find a way to escape justice? Keep watching to see how the entire police department responds when their criminal enterprise is exposed. The morning after the arrests, Walter awoke to the sound of his phone ringing incessantly. Local news outlets, national papers, and even cable news networks were requesting interviews about the elderly man who brought down corrupt cops. Walter declined them all, following Agent Reynolds' advice to maintain a low profile while the investigation continued. But silence couldn't stem the tide of public reaction sweeping through Oakwood Heights. The community had fractured almost immediately along predictable lines. Many residents, particularly younger ones and people of color, expressed outrage at the revelations of systematic targeting. Others, primarily white homeowners who had never experienced police harassment, defended the department and questioned the FBI's involvement in local matters. By mid-morning, Walter's email inbox and voicemail were full. Most messages expressed support, but a significant minority contained thinly veiled threats or accusations. "Troublemaker," "race baiter," "if you don't like how things are run here, move somewhere else." One particularly disturbing voicemail simply contained the sound of a gun being cocked and fired. Agent Johnson assured Walter that each threat was being documented and investigated, but the message was clear: powerful forces wanted him silenced. Meanwhile, the Oakwood Heights Police Department had launched an aggressive public relations campaign. Chief Thompson held a press conference on the steps of the station, his expression appropriately grave as he addressed the allegations. "The Oakwood Heights Police Department has always maintained the highest standards of professionalism and integrity," he stated firmly. "While we are deeply troubled by these accusations against 2 of our officers, we caution against rushing to judgment before all facts are known." Thompson described Moore and Wilson as individuals who, if guilty, acted entirely outside departmental policy and oversight. He emphasized words like isolated incident and aberration, framing the corruption as a contained problem rather than a systemic issue. "We fully support due process and a thorough investigation," Thompson concluded. "But we also ask the community to remember the hundreds of dedicated officers who serve with honor every day and not let the alleged actions of 2 individuals tarnish the reputation of our entire department." Walter watched the press conference on television, noting Thompson's careful language and the supportive officers arrayed behind him. "He's good," Walter commented to Agent Reynolds, who had stopped by to check on him. "Makes it sound like Moore and Wilson are lone wolves rather than part of an organized scheme that he directed." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Standard playbook. Isolate the problem, protect the institution, discredit the accusers." That last strategy became evident later that day when Walter began receiving calls from friends and neighbors about rumors circulating through the community. According to these whispers, Walter had a history of making trouble, of playing the race card, of fabricating complaints against authority figures. Some even suggested he had a criminal record that had been expunged. "They're trying to destroy your credibility," Michael said angrily when he called that evening. "Dad, you need to fight back. Make a public statement. I know several civil rights attorneys who would represent you pro bono." Walter considered his son's advice. "The FBI wants me to maintain a low profile while they build their case against Thompson. The court of public opinion moves faster than federal investigations," Michael argued. "If you don't control your narrative, they will." As if to prove Michael's point, the evening news included a segment featuring Gregory Palmer, attorney for the police union, raising questions about Walter's motives. "My clients categorically deny any wrongdoing," Palmer stated smoothly. "We have to ask why Mr. Jenkins, who has a history of filing complaints against public servants, would make such outlandish accusations, and why the FBI would devote resources to investigating them without proper verification." The reporter failed to challenge Palmer's characterization of Walter's history, allowing the insinuation to stand uncorrected. Walter's military record and decades of community service went unmentioned. The next morning brought more concerning developments. Agent Johnson arrived at Walter's home with troubling news. "We have reason to believe Chief Thompson is destroying evidence," he reported, showing Walter photographs taken by surveillance teams. "These show officers removing files from the station at 3 in the morning, and our source inside the department says Thompson has ordered a purge of all records related to traffic stops involving elderly residents." Walter's jaw tightened. "So he's covering his tracks." "Trying to," Johnson confirmed. "But he doesn't know how much we already have. Moore is talking, providing details about the entire operation. And the financial records don't lie." Nevertheless, the attempted cover-up forced the FBI to accelerate their timeline. "We need to secure those records before they all disappear," Reynolds explained during a conference call. "We're preparing to execute search warrants on the station and Thompson's residence, but we have to move carefully. One misstep and evidence becomes inadmissible." While the FBI navigated legal channels, Walter faced a personal dilemma. His natural inclination toward privacy and dignity conflicted with the growing need to counter the narrative being constructed against him. After careful consideration, he decided to organize a community meeting for victims to share their experiences. Eleanor Washington, despite her fear, agreed to host the gathering at her church. Word spread quietly through trusted networks, and on Thursday evening, 37 elderly black residents gathered in the church basement to share stories that many had never spoken aloud before. Walter opened the meeting with a simple statement: "For too long we have suffered in silence. Today we reclaim our voices." What followed was 3 hours of painful, powerful testimony. Men and women in their 70s and 80s described being stopped, searched, and robbed by officers sworn to protect them. They detailed the humiliation, the fear, the resignation that had kept them quiet. Some wept as they spoke. Others displayed a quiet rage that had simmered for years. Sarah Chen, invited by Walter to document the stories, recorded everything with the participants' permission. The resulting article, published 2 days later, was devastating in its simplicity. In their own words, elderly residents describe years of police theft and harassment. The piece featured photographs of dignified seniors alongside their testimonies, putting human faces to what had previously been abstract allegations. Public opinion began to shift. Younger residents organized a demonstration outside the police station. Signs reading "Protect Seniors, Not Corruption" and "Justice for Walter" appeared throughout the community. Local clergy members issued statements calling for accountability and healing, but the backlash intensified as well. Palmer, the police union attorney, appeared on local television with a new line of attack. "While we sympathize with these elderly individuals who believe they've been mistreated, memory is notoriously unreliable, especially in senior citizens. Without concrete evidence, these emotional appeals should not be the basis for dismantling a police department that has kept Oakwood Heights safe for decades." The implication that the victims were confused or fabricating stories out of failing memories was particularly offensive to Walter. His response came not through media statements but through action. He compiled his military service records, commendations, and 40 years of community involvement into a simple document that Sarah Chen published alongside Palmer's accusations. No editorial commentary was necessary. Walter's lifetime of service spoke for itself. As Walter's public profile grew, so did his discomfort with the attention. He had always valued his privacy, had navigated life by drawing as little notice as possible while maintaining his dignity. Now he found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought, portrayed as either a hero or a villain, depending on the source. "You're becoming a symbol," Lisa told him during her weekend visit. "People are rallying around you because you represent something bigger than just one incident." Walter understood this intellectually, but the emotional toll was considerable. The threatening calls continued. Strangers drove past his home at all hours. FBI protection remained in place, but Walter felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in. The first court hearing for Moore and Wilson brought these tensions to a head. Walter arrived at the courthouse to find demonstrators on both sides, supporters holding "Justice for Walter" signs and counter-protesters with "Back the Blue" banners. Inside, Walter sat silently in the gallery. As Moore and Wilson entered in suits rather than uniforms, their expressions a mixture of defiance and fear. Palmer presented their plea not guilty on all counts. He then launched into an argument that the entire case was based on entrapment, claiming the FBI had illegally manipulated his clients, using Walter as an unwitting pawn. "The marked currency represents fruit of the poisonous tree," Palmer argued dramatically. "Any evidence stemming from this unauthorized sting operation should be inadmissible." Walter watched the judge carefully during these arguments. Judge Harold Connolly was a 20-year veteran of the bench with known connections to Chief Thompson through the Oakwood Heights Country Club. His expression remained neutral, but Walter noticed how he leaned forward attentively during Palmer's arguments while appearing distracted during the federal prosecutor's responses. At the conclusion of the hearing, Judge Connolly set bail at $50,000 each, an unusually low amount given the severity of the charges and the defendants' positions of authority. With the police union immediately posting bail, Moore and Wilson walked free until trial. As they exited the courthouse, their eyes locked briefly with Walter's. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear: the system was closing ranks to protect its own. Walter's faith in the process was shaken but not broken. As Agent Reynolds drove him home, he reminded himself of how far they had already come. 2 corrupt officers had been arrested. Dozens of victims had found their voices. The conspiracy was exposed, even if its leader remained protected for now. "They still think they can wait this out," Walter said quietly. "That I'll give up or die or be discredited." Reynolds glanced at him. "What do you think, mister?" Jenkins Walter looked out at the community he had called home for 4 decades, where he had never been fully accepted despite his contributions. "I think they've never understood people like me. We've been fighting these battles our entire lives. We know how to endure." Reynolds smiled slightly. "That's what I told Agent Johnson when he worried you might back down under pressure. I said, you don't survive to 73 as a black man in America without learning how to outlast your opponents." Walter nodded the truth of this observation, settling into his bones. The system was pushing back with all its considerable power. But Walter Jenkins had been pushed his entire life, and he was still standing. 3 days after the bail hearing, Agent Reynolds arrived at Walter's home with unexpected news. "We have a new development," she said, her expression cautiously optimistic. "An officer from inside the department has come forward." Walter raised his eyebrows. "Someone's breaking ranks," Reynolds nodded. "Officer Alicia Rodriguez, 5 years on the force. She approached us yesterday with documentation of the broader scheme." According to Reynolds, Rodriguez had been keeping her own records for nearly 2 years, disturbed by patterns she observed, but afraid to report them through internal channels. She claims at least 15 officers are actively involved in targeting black residents, with most of the department at least peripherally aware of what's happening. The most damning revelation was Rodriguez's testimony about a department-wide slush fund built from stolen money. She says there's an unofficial account they call the retirement supplement, Reynolds explained. Officers who participate in the scheme receive payouts when they leave the force, ensuring their continued silence. Walter absorbed this information, understanding its significance. The blue wall is starting to crack. Exactly. Rodriguez is the first, but there may be others with consciences who've been afraid to come forward. We've placed her in protective custody after she received threats. Walter requested to meet with Rodriguez, feeling a connection to this officer who had chosen integrity over loyalty to a corrupt system. Reynolds arranged a secure meeting at the FBI field office the following day. Officer Rodriguez was younger than Walter had expected, perhaps 30, with a tense, vigilant demeanor that spoke of recent stress. She stood when Walter entered the conference room, extending her hand formally. "Mr. Jenkins, thank you for meeting with me." Walter shook her hand. "Thank you for your courage, Officer Rodriguez." They sat across from each other, an elderly black civilian and a young Latina officer, both outsiders, in their own ways within the Oakwood Heights power structure. "Why did you decide to come forward now?" Walter asked directly. Rodriguez's expression was solemn. "I became a police officer to help people to serve my community. What's happening in our department is a betrayal of everything the badge is supposed to represent." She described joining the force idealistic and eager, then gradually becoming aware of unwritten rules and practices. At first it was small things, certain residents being stopped more frequently, citations issued along demographic lines rather than actual violations. "Then I noticed the pattern with elderly residents, particularly in your neighborhood." Walter nodded, encouraging her to continue. Chief Thompson called it proactive revenue generation. In private briefings, Rodriguez explained. Never in writing, always in closed-door sessions with trusted officers. But the message was clear: certain residents were targets, not citizens to protect. She had begun documenting these patterns, keeping her own detailed records separate from official reports. When Walter's case made headlines, she knew it might be her only opportunity to expose the truth. "They're already calling me a traitor," she said, her voice steady, despite the evident strain. "My locker was vandalized yesterday. Someone slashed my tires. I've received threatening calls at my mother's house." Walter recognized the tactics. "They're trying to isolate you, make you doubt yourself." "Exactly like they're doing to you," Rodriguez observed. "I've seen the internal memos about your case. They're painting you as a troublemaker with a vendetta against police." She hesitated, then added, "You should know they're not going to stop at discrediting you. Chief Thompson is desperate." That desperation became evident that very evening. Walter returned home to find his front door ajar, the lock broken. With FBI agents quickly securing the scene, Walter entered to discover a targeted destruction. Family photographs had been smashed, particularly those featuring Walter in his naval uniform. His military commendations lay torn on the floor. Nothing of value had been taken. This was not a robbery, but an intimidation attempt. The violation of his home, his sanctuary, struck Walter more deeply than he had expected. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a momentary urge to retreat, to prioritize his safety over justice. Agent Johnson documented the scene meticulously. "This crosses a line," he said, his professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine anger. "Breaking into a federal witness's home during an active investigation adds witness tampering to the charges." Walter stood in his living room surveying the damage. His eyes fell on a photograph of Elaine that had been deliberately shattered. He picked up the frame, carefully removing the broken glass. "They think this will make me back down," he said quietly. "They've never understood what we've already endured." The following morning, Walter made a decision that surprised even his son. Against the advice of both Michael and Agent Reynolds, he announced that he would make a public statement on the courthouse steps. "It's time to speak for myself," he explained when Reynolds expressed concern. "They're controlling the narrative because I've remained silent." Dressed in his best suit, the one he reserved for special occasions, Walter stood before a hastily assembled group of reporters. At 73, he cut an imposing figure. Tall, dignified, his silver hair, neatly trimmed his posture military straight despite his years. "My name is Walter Jenkins," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I am a United States Navy veteran who served this country honorably for 30 years. I have lived in Oakwood Heights for 40 years, where I have been a taxpayer, a volunteer, and a good neighbor. Recently, I was robbed of $8,000 by an Oakwood Heights police officer during a traffic stop based on a fabricated violation." Walter recounted the incident in precise detail, then expanded to the broader pattern. "I am not alone. Dozens of elderly black residents have experienced similar thefts under the guise of law enforcement. This is not about a few bad officers. This is about a systematic practice of targeting vulnerable citizens based on their race and age." He addressed the attempts to discredit him directly. "To those who have questioned my character or motivation, I say this: I have served this country with honor. I have paid taxes in this community for 4 decades. I have earned the right to be treated with dignity and respect under the law. And I will not be silent in the face of injustice, no matter how powerful those responsible may be." Walter concluded with words that would be repeated across social media and news outlets throughout the day. Justice is not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on race or wealth or power. It is a right guaranteed to all Americans. And I intend to see that right upheld not just for myself, but for every citizen who has been victimized by those sworn to protect them. The impact of Walter's statement was immediate and far-reaching. Video clips spread rapidly across social media platforms. National news networks picked up the story. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. Within hours, Walter had transformed from a local figure to a national symbol of courage against institutional corruption. Chief Thompson clearly recognized the shifting public sentiment. That evening, he convened an emergency meeting with political allies at the Oakwood Heights Country Club. Unknown to them, the FBI had obtained a warrant to monitor the gathering, having established sufficient probable cause through Officer Rodriguez's testimony and financial records. The recording captured Thompson's growing desperation. "This needs to end now," he told the assembled group, which included 2 city council members and a county judge. "Jenkins is turning this into a circus. If he keeps talking, more people will come forward." One council member suggested reaching out through back channels. "Everyone has a price. Figure out what he wants and give it to him." Later that night, Walter received the call with the offer of $20,000 to drop his cooperation with the investigation. The FBI traced it to a burner phone purchased by Thompson's brother-in-law, adding another piece to the growing body of evidence. Thompson's increasing desperation accelerated the FBI's timeline. With Rodriguez's detailed testimony and the financial records connecting the scheme to Thompson, they secured warrants for coordinated raids on the homes of 7 additional officers implicated in the corruption. The overnight operation caught the officers by surprise. Computers, phones, and financial records were seized. 2 officers, facing the overwhelming evidence against them, immediately offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The evidence seized during the raids provided the final connections needed to link the scheme directly to City Hall. Records showed regular meetings between Thompson and the mayor's chief of staff, followed by transfers of funds to campaign accounts through various shell companies. The mayor's office immediately issued a statement distancing itself from the police department, claiming no knowledge of any improper activities and pledging full cooperation with federal investigators. With the case building rapidly, Walter finally agreed to give Sarah Chen an exclusive interview detailing his full experience. The resulting front-page article, "A Lifetime of Fighting Walter Jenkins and the Battle for Equal Justice," placed the recent events in the context of Walter's decades of quietly standing his ground against discrimination. The piece included historical context about housing discrimination in Oakwood Heights, the challenges Walter had faced, integrating the neighborhood in the 1980s, and the subtle but persistent biases he had navigated throughout his life. "I'm not a crusader," Walter told Chen. "I'm just a man who believes in dignity and fair treatment. When Officer Moore took my money, he wasn't just stealing cash. He was stealing my humanity, my right to be treated as a full citizen. That's something I couldn't let stand." Chen's article resonated deeply with readers across the country, many of whom recognized parallels to their own experiences. Letters and emails poured in from people sharing similar stories of police harassment and systemic discrimination. Civil rights organizations reached out to offer support and resources. Walter found himself in his 8th decade at the center of what was rapidly becoming a landmark civil rights case. Agent Reynolds updated Walter regularly as the case expanded. "The financial trail goes back at least 7 years," she explained during one briefing. "We've identified over 100 potential victims based on banking records and traffic stop data. The total amount stolen likely exceeds $2 million. Walter absorbed this information with a grim sense of validation. All those years, all those people suffering in silence, thinking they were alone. Not anymore, Reynolds assured him. Thanks to you, they have a voice now. As the evidence mounted, Walter reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had never sought attention or accolades. He had simply wanted what everyone deserves, to be treated with basic dignity and respect. In fighting for that fundamental right, he had inadvertently become the cornerstone of a case that might change policing in communities like Oakwood Heights across the country. He thought often of Elaine during these weeks, wondering what she would make of it all. She had been the quiet force behind his persistence throughout their marriage, the one who reminded him that standing tall didn't always mean standing loudly. "Just don't let them see you bend," she would say whenever he faced discrimination. As the case against Thompson and his network built toward its conclusion, Walter knew that whatever came next, he had remained true to Elaine's wisdom. He had not bent, not broken, not compromised his dignity. And in that steadfastness, he had perhaps done more to change his community than in all the decades of quiet persistence that came before. 6 months after Officer Moore had stopped Walter Jenkins on that fateful afternoon, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was filled to capacity. Walter entered wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn for Elaine's funeral, for Lisa's law school graduation, for all the most significant moments of his later years. He moved with deliberate dignity down the center aisle, aware of the eyes following his progress. In the gallery behind him sat dozens of community members who had traveled from Oakwood Heights to witness this day. Eleanor Washington nodded solemnly as he passed. Clarence Thomas gave him a subtle thumbs up. Ruby Davis reached out to squeeze his hand briefly. Michael and Lisa sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of pride and concern for the grandfather who had become an unexpected symbol of resistance. Walter took his seat at the witness table, his posture military straight despite his 73 years. Across the courtroom sat Officer Bradley Moore, Sergeant James Wilson, and Chief Robert Thompson, each with their respective attorneys. Moore looked diminished in his civilian clothes, his eyes downcast occasionally, whispering urgently to his lawyer. Wilson maintained a facade of confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thompson alone seemed truly unrepentant, his gaze challenging as it met Walter's across the room. Judge Marilyn Harlow, a federal judge with a reputation for impartiality and thoroughness, called the court to order. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Bennett, began methodically presenting the government's case. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records showing the flow of stolen money through offshore accounts, testimony from multiple victims describing nearly identical experiences, internal police documents revealing the systematic targeting of elderly black residents, recordings of Thompson discussing the scheme with other officers, and perhaps most damning, the marked bills from Walter's case traced directly to accounts controlled by all 3 defendants. When Walter's turn came to testify, he spoke with the quiet authority that had characterized his entire life. He recounted the traffic stop, the theft, the intimidation that followed. He described the violation of having his home invaded, his privacy destroyed, his character questioned. But more powerfully, he placed his experience in the context of a lifetime navigating systemic discrimination. "This was not the first time I have faced injustice because of my race," Walter testified. "But at 73 years old, I decided it would be the last time I would remain silent about it." During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to discredit Walter's testimony. Thompson's lawyer implied that Walter was confused about the details, that his memory at his age might be unreliable. "Mr. Jenkins," the attorney asked with exaggerated patience, "isn't it possible that in the stress of the moment you misinterpreted Officer Moore's actions, that what you perceived as theft was actually standard police procedure for handling potential evidence. Walter's response was measured but firm. "Sir, I have lived 73 years as a black man in America. I know the difference between proper procedure and being robbed. Officer Moore put my money in his pocket, not an evidence bag. He issued no receipt, he made no record of the seizure, and he threatened me if I reported it. There was no misinterpretation possible." As Walter stepped down from the witness stand, he felt a weight lifting. Whatever the outcome, he had spoken his truth in a forum where it had to be heard. The prosecution continued building their case. Officer Rodriguez testified about the department-wide culture of corruption, the internal slush fund, and the explicit targeting of black seniors. FBI financial analysts traced the money through elaborate networks of shell companies, all leading back to accounts controlled by Thompson and other senior officers. Finally, in a devastating blow to the defense, Officer Moore himself took the stand, having accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against his superiors. Moore described in detail how he had been instructed to target specific residents, how the money was distributed through the department, and how Thompson had personally approved each step of the operation. The defense teams struggled to counter this mountain of evidence, their strategies increasingly focused on technicalities and procedural objections rather than substantive refutations of the charges. When the jury retired to deliberate, legal experts predicted a quick verdict. They were correct. After just 4 hours, the jury returned with unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. Walter sat perfectly still as the verdicts were read, his expression revealing nothing of the profound vindication he felt. Only when Lisa reached over the barrier to grasp his hand did he allow himself a single nod of acknowledgement. Judge Harlow scheduled sentencing for the following month, but made her perspective clear in her remarks to the defendants. "The crimes you have been convicted of represent the most egregious breach of public trust," she stated, her voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "You were empowered by the community to protect and serve. Instead, you chose to victimize those most vulnerable, to exploit your authority for personal gain, and to corrupt the very institution of justice you were sworn to uphold." 1 month later, Walter returned to the courthouse for the sentencing. Judge Harlow showed no leniency. Moore received 12 years for his role in the scheme, despite his cooperation with prosecutors. Wilson was sentenced to 18 years. And Thompson, as the architect and chief beneficiary of the conspiracy, received the maximum sentence of 25 years. "Let this serve as a clear message," Judge Harlow declared. "The badge is not a license to victimize. Authority is not immunity from consequences. And justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately be served." In the aftermath of the trial, the Department of Justice announced a complete restructuring of the Oakwood Heights Police Department. An interim chief was appointed from outside the community with a mandate to reform the department from the ground up. Walter, though eager to return to his private life, recognized the importance of community involvement in this process. Together with Eleanor Washington, Clarence Thomas, and other victims, he established a civilian oversight committee to ensure transparency and accountability in policing practices. Lisa, having recently passed the bar exam, volunteered her legal expertise to the committee. The FBI returned Walter's $8,000 along with an additional $12,000 in damages awarded by the court. True to his original intention, Walter used the money to establish a scholarship for black students pursuing careers in public service or law enforcement. The first recipient was Eleanor Washington's grandson, a promising young man with dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. The new police chief, Dr. Vanessa Williams, a black woman with a Ph.D. in criminal justice and 20 years of law enforcement experience, made a point of personally delivering Walter's scholarship check to its first recipient. The ceremony, held at the Oakwood Heights Community Center, where Walter still taught chess to children twice a week, symbolized the beginning of a new relationship between the police department and the community it served. In the months that followed, Walter gradually returned to the quiet life he preferred. The media attention faded. The threats stopped. He could once again tend his garden, drive his Cadillac through the neighborhood, and shop at the local grocery store without being recognized or approached. but subtle changes marked his daily interactions. The same bank teller who had once viewed him with suspicion now greeted him by name with genuine warmth. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact stopped to chat. The community that had tolerated but never truly welcomed him for 40 years began slowly but perceptibly to acknowledge him as one of their own. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after Officer Moore had first stopped him, Walter visited Elaine's grave with a bouquet of her favorite yellow roses. "We did it, sweetheart," he said quietly, arranging the flowers in the small vase embedded in the headstone. "Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." As Walter drove home, he noticed a police cruiser pull onto the road behind him. For a moment, old instincts surfaced. Twile. The slight tension in his shoulders, the automatic mental review of his driving, the readiness to navigate yet another potentially dangerous interaction. But when the cruiser pulled alongside at a stoplight, the officer, a young black woman Walter didn't recognize, simply nodded respectfully and continued on her way. Walter watched the cruiser disappear around a corner, then continued his drive home, a gentle smile crossing his face. The world hadn't changed entirely. Prejudice and discrimination wouldn't disappear overnight. But in this small corner of America, one man's refusal to accept injustice had created a ripple that might, with time and continued vigilance, grow into genuine transformation. And for Walter Jenkins in his 74th year, that was enough. What would you have done in Walter's position? Would you have had the courage to stand up against such powerful corruption? Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this incredible story of one man's fight for justice. If you found Walter's journey inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one person really can make a difference, even against seemingly impossible odds. Thank you for watching, and remember, it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Walter Jenkins' story reminds us that dignity is not granted by others, but maintained through our own resolve. His journey teaches us that systemic injustice thrives in silence, and speaking truth to power requires tremendous courage, but creates ripples far beyond one individual. This elderly man's stand against corruption shows that it's never too late to demand justice, and sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply refusing to be silenced. His methodical approach, gathering evidence, building alliances, and maintaining his integrity, despite intimidation, provides a blueprint for confronting institutional wrongdoing. Walter demonstrates that even against overwhelming odds, persistence and documentation can overcome entrenched corruption. The community's transformation reveals how one person's courage can inspire others to find their voices. Perhaps most importantly, Walter's story teaches us that change rarely comes from institutions themselves, but from individuals willing to risk their comfort and safety for principles greater than themselves. His legacy isn't just in the convictions secured or the department reformed, but in showing that accountability is possible when ordinary citizens stand firm in their dignity and demand the justice they deserve. Has there been a moment in your life when you had to choose between staying silent or standing up against an injustice? What gave you the courage to speak out, or what held you back? Share your experience in the comments below. If Walter's unwavering dignity in the face of corruption inspired, you hit that like button to help more people discover this powerful story. Subscribe to our channel for more narratives about everyday heroes fighting against discrimination and injustice in all its forms. These stories remind us that change begins with individual courage. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement to stand up for what's right in their own life or community. Thank you for joining us in celebrating those who refuse to bend when faced with injustice. And remember, your voice matters more than you know.